Good morning and good evening, depending on your respective time zones. I, Sarah Rahaman Shaikh, project lead for the Story Project 14 by www.tellmeyourstory.biz, welcome you to the inaugural episode of Echoes and Whispers series. It intends to explore various noises and conversations emerging from our internal and external hemispheres. Tell Me Your Story calls for submission on the theme, inviting people to interpret it in their own creative ways. Registrations are also open for a host of workshops or for new or aspiring authors. This evening, I am extremely privileged to have with us today Dr. Christine VanPool, Leanna Renee, Hieber, and Dr. Madeline Potter. Tonight, we are going to delve into the fascinating intricacies about witches, black magic, and evil mysticism, evil eye, and why are they associated with women. Let me begin with introducing our first panelist of the panel discussion, Dr. Christine S. VanPool. Dr. Christine S. VanPool is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Missouri, specializing in cognitive anthropology with a focus on shamanism, spirits, magic, and altered states of consciousness (ASC) and the visual representation of such states. Her most recent book is an anthropological study of spirits, which discusses how ASC cross-culturally facilitates spirit-human interactions. Welcome, ma'am. We are immensely delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a delight to be here with everyone.
Our second panelist of session is Leanna Renee Hieber. Leanna Renee Hieber is an award-winning author of fiction and non-fiction. A Haunted History of Invisible Women, co-authored with Andrea Janes, was a Bram Stoker Award finalist, and Leanna's Strangely Beautiful saga garnered 3 Prism Awards. Featured in film and television on shows like Mysteries at the Museum, she is a guide for NYC's Bureaus of the Dead, lecturing nationwide on paranormal themes. Welcome, ma'am. We are truly glad to have you with us today.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Our third panelist is Dr. Madeline Potter. Dr. Madeline Potter is an early career teaching and research fellow in the literature of the long 19th century at the University of Edinburgh. Her specialism is in Gothic literature with a particular focus on monstrosity. Her first academic book, Theological Monsters, Religion and Irish Gothic, is forthcoming with University of Wales Press. Her trade book, The Roma, A Travelling History, will be published by the Bodley Head in the UK and HarperCollins in the USA. Welcome, ma'am. We are immensely blessed to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a huge pleasure to be here.
I would now like to take the opportunity to proceed with the first common question of our inaugural episode. The first question being, in what ways have historical and cultural narratives contributed to the associations of witches, black magic, and evil mysticism with women? And how have these perceptions evolved or persisted in modern society? Dr. Christine, ma'am, you may begin first.
First, I want to say that this is a really interesting question, and it is worthy of probably many books by many authors. Where to start, right? So I was just like, this is a great question. I just wish we could write a book. But I was going to say, historically, there are some really good authors out there. Edward Baver, he's done a really good analysis of witchcraft. He has several journal articles. He lays out some of the historic trajectories on it, and I'm sure the other panelists can talk to this, but some of it has to do with social problems coming out of the Little Ice Age. So thinking about the 1600s, it was a really tough time for humanity, at least in Europe and what will then become the United States as people are moving across the globe and into India, that there was uncertainty environmentally, there's uncertainty socially, there were more spinstress and widows, and people were starving, and people are getting suspicious of each other. And if you don't understand something and there's suspicion, then you can label it evil or bad when you have this type of low-level conflict, for lack of a better word. So I think some of that comes from a historic narrative. I really like Edward's discussion of the Little Ice Age as a social economic factor into that. And so that's probably where I would start. And I, as an anthropologist, I'm always amazed at what we as humans can believe and choose to hold on to, and why Some of the stuff is prevailing with that we could get into later, but I thought I would just throw that out there first as a historic narrative and then open it up if that's okay with you, Sarah. This is your show, so let me know. But I didn't want to say, everything because there's so much to say, but that's where I'd open it, historic.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful views. Next, I would like Leanna Reader Hieber, ma'am, to please elucidate the point.
I think particularly in America, I think a lot of associations with witchcraft, we know from the Salem witch trials that things got really out of hand in 1692. And that to dovetail on what Dr. VanPool is talking about, that suspicions and wanting somebody to blame for social problems. There's a confluence of problems that are in play by the time you get to 1692 in New England, and sort of the hysteria of the witch trials was sort of a focal point that I really think goes back to kind of the concept of original sin in biblical traditions being associated with women. And so I think when you have a very restrictive, puritanical Christian society that the Salem residents were dealing with, where really, honestly, everything about that world was a battle with the devil around every single corner. There's a certain amount of paranoia that's already in the water by the time that you get into the actual trials themselves. Now, the victims of the Salem witch trials in 1692 were not exclusively women, but they were mostly women, and they were usually women who had become widows, to again dovetail on what had been said, women alone, women who were vulnerable, women who were poor, who didn't have people to advocate for them. And so they became easy targets. So I think that vulnerability historically has also been a part of this, and not understanding or appreciating women's roles in society, that kind of marginalization across class, across race, across different biases that are a part of the United States narrative, certainly. So I focus personally, my expertise on this is in looking at the Salem witch trials. And in my research, I found a particularly valuable book that I highly recommend called The Devil in the Shape of a Woman.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would now ask Madeline Potter, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. So I fully agree with both these points, and I think they're absolutely brilliant. I want to add to that also an intersectional racialized perspective, particularly the figure of the Romany woman as a witch. So the Roma are a heterogeneous group who were traditionally nomadic, who originate in northern India and left India roughly around the 11th century, getting into Western Europe around the 15th century. And Romany women have traditionally practiced a particular tradition of divination and fortune telling. So when the Roma arrived into Europe and North America, they faced very fierce racism. And for women, there was this intersection between racism and misogyny that ended up kind of really flattening them into stereotypes, particularly Romany women into stereotypes of witches and fortune tellers who essentially end up cursing anybody unfortunate enough to cross their path. And this is something that has been picked up in literature and has continued to endure in the public imagination in kind of gothic and horror media today. Think about Drag Me to Hell, for example. Think about Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, and the Romany curse that is put on Angel as well. So I think popular media and literature has tended to kind of tag onto a particular history of marginalization of, Roman women as witches and fortune tellers, and then contribute to this vision of them being mysticized, of them being rendered mysterious and evil, that continues to be very much part of discourse today. So just wanted to bring in that racial dimension of this as well, which isn't to say that this is a sweeping statement, but this is yet another dimension that contributes to the association between women and kind of evil witch vision.
So true, ma'am. Thank you so much for your great answer. Now I would like to begin with our Q&A segment then. The first question is for Dr. Christina's VanPool. Ma'am, what religious doctrine and practices historically contributed to the association of women with witchcraft, black magic, and the evil eye? And you may refer to your book or your paper as you wish. Thank you.
Okay. I'm an anthropologist, as we have just discussed. I think it's, again, the history and the proponents of how this all comes together is really complex, and a lot of parts are coming through. But I think that there was some type of shift. So in our evolutionary history as humans, we were hunter and gatherers. So people were walking around on landscape, they were gathering resources. Women tended to be the ones that were taking care of children. They're the ones that are also taking care of injured males that have been maybe out at a hunting party and were hurt with a broken leg or something like that. They're tending them. And they're also taking care of the elderly, the people that are starting to get sick and can't go as fast or as long distances. And women had to be super, if you will, savvy, intelligent, and watching the environment. We have to be concerned. Is there a lion over in the bushes? Do I need to be concerned about that? Do I need to be concerned about somebody coming up on, is that person friend or foe? Is that somebody that I need to trust or not trust? How do I deal with these things? And so women became what I call super sensors. So women through our evolutionary history became really good at sensing all kinds of stuff. And in modern context, we know that. So for example, we're finding that in the world of science, women are better able to smell things like mold and bacteria than men are. And so if you have a woman who is with their tribe wandering around the landscape and they get to a cave, she may not know it's bacteria or mold, but she may sense that this is bad, this is not good. So let's go down the road, let's go down the river, let's go somewhere else. Or, she's just really perceptive. She can feel the cackles in the back of her neck and she thinks there's a lion out there or a herd of wolves or whatever. And she could sense that. And then through time, she continues to do that. So you get women that are able to sense things. We also know that women are better with sensing things like chemicals in soils and all kinds of stuff. Women have these abilities. And I think that we call that intuitive when we didn't understand in science, these intuitive women that know how to sense the world around them. And for a while, people and probably value that. And the intuitiveness of, a woman's like a computer, not to, make that, but the analogy is a woman can take in all this data. She can go through all these fields of all these different senses, smell, sight, cackles on the back of her neck, whatever. And then she can run through the program and say, oh man, this might happen or this might happen. And women that are really gifted with using their abilities from all these senses we have would be able to predict maybe things that would come out correctly or know what's going to happen. And at part of our history, women were the oracles of Delphi, the Delphi oracles. We had famous mediums, women that probably took in all kinds of environmental data, the knowledge, they're being gifted knowledge from other women. They become really good at what they do. And for a long time, I think that's what women did. But then I really like Edward Vaver's work on witchcraft. But you have also, we were talking about with Dr. Porter and Leanna, these different mechanisms. But men are also in the 1600s wanting to be doctors. So we had women that were midwives, learning how to do all this type of stuff. They're the herbalists, they're the healers, they're the ones that understood the plants, they're the ones that were walking out on the landscape, figuring this all out through our entire history. And now men are wanting what women have. They're wanting the power, they're wanting the knowledge. And if you're trying to make money and sell yourself, you're going to say, oh, well, she's in with the devil, to borrow from Leanna. She's in with the devil. She knows this stuff, not because she's intelligent or because she has really good sensory perception or something like that. No, that's the devil's work over there. And then you get that challenge back. And I think that's part of the angst of the trying to get the medical profession up and running as well. But also, as we've already said, many of us with the Judeo-Christian, you label the oracles evil, the gypsies are evil. You start undercutting that too, because these are challenges to the patriarchic societies that we're we're building. So that's a very quick answer, and there's so much more I could talk about in the world of science, but I'm going to leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You have touched amazing, interesting points. Next question I would like to ask Leanna, ma'am. Ma'am, in your book, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghost, the unspoken female characters are very much prioritized. How have historical events and societal attitudes contributed to the association of witchcraft and black magic with women? And I'm asking because it has been exemplified by figures like Bridget Bishop from the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, Bridget Bishop in particular is a really good focal point for me to kind of be an example of all of the things that went wrong in 1692. She was a woman who, once she became a widow, was all the more vulnerable. And she was also a woman that was known to be kind of mouthy. She basically would quarrel with her husband when he was still alive, publicly. She had the audacity to wear a red paragon bodice. Now, I'm using that specific term. It's basically, that was a term for this red outfit that she wore. And it's sort of really shaming her even in 1692. It's the sort of what was she wearing kind of thing that it blows my mind that it's still part of women's victimization now. That was specifically noted as part of one of the things that damned her in the eyes of the public, and it was noted in court records. So this was anything that was outside of what at that point was a very, very strict puritanical norm. Anything that could be seen as deviating from that was suspect. And so to just, to immediately kind of go on from what Dr. VanPool was talking about the idea of women having, being midwives and being aware of herbs and other healing things, the line between that as like the cut wife, the women who are dealing with herbal remedies, that was very, very common, and still persists in women's kind of folkloric abilities to heal, and like, what was your grandmother's cure for X, Y, or Z? Those things still persist in our modern culture, but there was a distinct power shift of the church wanted the power of healing and prayer and mysticism, and again, anything that was not understood scientifically from any of the things anthropologically that Dr. VanPool was talking about, all of those things became this mystical and suspect. Women as a magical figure could very easily be turned against them. So that definitely was the case with Bridget Bishop. She wasn't like the local cutwife. She wasn't the local healer. She was a mouthy lady who also happened to have property that was kind of prime Salem, Massachusetts property, that then quickly after her execution, she was the first to be executed in 1692 during the witch trial epidemic there. That property was seized by local authorities. So another angle of the Salem witch trials was a blatant property grab. So the more that you look into that whole entire thing, the more angry I became in doing it. I was supposed to do 3 chapters in Haunted History of Invisible Women. I was supposed to do 3 chapters about the Salem witch trials, and I could only do 2 because I actually had heart palpitations after a certain point of diving into this stuff, and I just had to kind of walk away after reading about Dorothy Good, who was a 4-year-old who was imprisoned for witchcraft, and it just I kind of had to step back and say, okay. Her mother had been executed. Sarah Good was another one of the victims. So these things can be really, really, really dangerous if any of these power dynamics get to the level of where the law is putting people to death for something that is a perceived threat. For me, that's very, very, I think that's scary historically, but it's also something we have to be very aware of in our modern society, of how are we weaponizing narratives against the marginalized.
So true, ma'am. And yeah, like the witches, during that time, I believe the society just needed an excuse. Whenever a woman wanted to voice against something bad, they just wanted an excuse to suppress a woman. And that is how witchcraft took its course. The next question I would like to ask Madeline Potter. According to your new project, Hematopoetics, Blood and the Gothic Imagination, how do theological discourse and medical realism of the 19th century influence the portrayal of women as sources of supernatural evil in Gothic literature, and what role does the depiction of blood play in these narratives?
So it's a very complicated one, because what we get in 1818 is James Blundell performs the first successful transfusion of human blood in the history of human blood transfusion. But he does so partly by accident. So what happens over the span of the 19th century up until like 1902 is that people realize that transfusions of blood sometimes work, and then when they work, they manage to save lives and they're brilliant. But they often don't work, and they don't work because they haven't discovered blood types. So they transfuse blood from incompatible blood types to people, and then they die. They also don't really understand that you can't transfuse animal blood into human veins. So they do that quite a lot as well. And the whole process, and I mean, when we think about Victorian medicine today, it seems a very kind of primitive endeavor, but actually they were really experimenting with these things. In Dracula, Van Helsing refers to the 19th century as the scientific, skeptical, matter-of-fact 19th century. So they saw themselves as very scientifically enlightened. But blood transfusions are, in a way, this sort of magical thing, because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and they really don't know why. Now, what's interesting is that very often when blood transfusions are needed are for postpartum hemorrhage, so for women bleeding out after they give birth. So there is an association between blood transfusions usually and the female body. So there is this kind of extra sense of, okay, we're making progress with science, we're trying to at least, but then here comes the woman's body and throws it all off, and we don't really know why. So that seeps into, so the periodical press starts panicking, and they start publishing all kinds of Gothic short stories that are largely forgotten today about human-animal hybrids, and they're usually women who've just given birth. There's one that Edith Nesbit published under her pen name together with her husband about a cat-woman hybrid. And so there are so many accounts in the periodical press, that sensationalized accounts of these things, that often kind of place the female body, and not just the female body, but the process of birth, at this kind of really weird intersection between, you know, we're making scientific progress, but also there's this kind of lingering magic, there's this lingering mystery that we don't quite understand. At the same time, what we get in the 19th century is also a move away from what I call mainstream Protestantism towards trying to make various aspects of religious practice and spiritual practice material. So we get, for example, the Oxford movement, which is trying to go back to Catholic sacramentality, but we also get spirit photography and occultism and all kinds of things that try to locate spirits or grace or the divine materially. And very often blood is variously at the core of this process. So blood becomes this weird fluid that's both very scientific and very mysterious and very magical in that sense. And it's often associated with the female body and with birth. So by extension also with death and Gothic literature, because that's what the Gothic does.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your fantastic, fascinating views. Now I would like to move on to the second set of questions. Christian, ma'am, Christine, ma'am, in relation to your paper, Shaman Pod, Sympathetic Magic and Spinning Souls Among the Medio Period Casas Grandes, Altered States of Consciousness in Other Than Human Persons, how do effigies and practices of sympathetic magic in shamanism, particularly involving animal spirits, influence the human life? What role does women play in executing the shaman mysticism?
That is another question one could write many books on. So that's such a great question. I thought about that for a while. I'm like, oh my, which way to go? Because there's so much information. First off, I would like to say that a lot of indigenous people on the globe think that objects have spirit. And so anthropologists, of course, call this animism, but there's some type of connection between the object that you're wanting to deal with, but also the soul. And there's some type of magical relationship between the object that is being used and then the forces and the power that is trying to be manipulated. And so that's the connection with the sympathetic magic. Is there some type of, we're now physicists are starting to get into this. They're trying to talk about string theory and movement from afar, where things are related and things are starting to move around. It's a really exciting time to be a physicist, I think. But anyway, so that's what happens is these things somehow can be used to manipulate the unseen or manipulate that power. Women are part of that process in the Casas Grandes region. We can't say for sure. I don't have a time machine yet. I'm working on it. No time machine that we can not go back and look at it. But we're pretty sure that the women are making the pottery, that the women understand clay. I would suggest clay is one of the most magical mediums known to humanity. It shapes the world. It does all kinds of stuff. Anyway, we could just have a whole lecture on just the magic of clay. But women know how to manipulate it. They know how to fire it. They know how to take care of it. They know all these subtle properties. Again, they're super sensory. They're able to negotiate with the clay. And then they can take something that's a made being that has part of their own soul. So the Puebloan people of the American Southwest, the women pottery say that they negotiate with clay, Earth Mother, her own, the potter's soul, and then when you put it into a fire, it's the fire spirit working with that pot. So you create this whole new made being that's kind of like a child. You have earth part, potter part, and then the fire part. So you have this mega important person, pot person, and then you can use that to talk to other your ancestors that might be Earth Mother, or your ancestors that might be human ancestors, or your ancestors that might be fire. And these make these really powerful objects because of these relationships, deep networks, and women could use those and manipulate it. And they were really part of, I would say, the shamanic arts. And there are other cases from like the Inuit and other groups up in Mongolia. The women do the parkas, they do the sewing, they do a lot of the stuff that the shaman regalia wear. And that's not just clothes for clothes. There's all kinds of symbols, and those symbols on the clothing are the actual spirits themselves. So they're putting the spirits in their clothing. So when they're doing their dancing or doing their meditative work or doing whatever they're doing, they're interacting with all those spirits. So that's something that women do. And they're, I would say, very important in the role of shamanic crafts to do this, to interact with the spirits, to manipulate and modify the world for the effects that they're trying to get from problem childbirthing that keeps coming up. I keep thinking about midwives, that if you can use pottery and sing a song and have the souls of the ancestors and dreaming about water and flowing, and use the metaphor for the blood is life-giving. It's also very dangerous. Women's blood is probably the most dangerous thing in anthropological literature. I just wanted to add that to Dr. Potter, that cross-culturally, and especially in the Americas, women, when they're menstruating, are the most dangerous people on the planet. In fact, they had to have moon huts. And so you put them out away from the hunters and gatherers. And there's even tales of the Apache and the Otoham in Arizona were at battle, at war. And a woman saw the Otoham coming up to raid her family, but she knew she was more dangerous than those hunters, that she did not tell her family about the raid, because she knew she could kill her entire family, because her blood at that point was so powerful. And that's something else that we see as women understand, that there are all these mechanism, force, and power. And so, but you can have women at certain times that are so powerful that they can use and manipulate these objects to elicit what we might call shamanic, for lack of a word, magic or healing or protection even as well. I hope that kind of answers your question. That's a tough question, and I could say probably another 5 hours on this topic, but I think that's good for now.
That was a magnificent answer, ma'am. I think you touched upon great topics that the audience would be absolutely enthralled with. Uh, the next question is for Leanna, ma'am. In relation to your book, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghost, what psychological factors you have found contribute to the enduring association of women with witchcraft and the evil eye, and how do these factors shape the stories and myths that surround female ghosts?
I think it all comes down to a fundamental distrust of women that is very historically embedded to this modern day. Just to sort of dovetail on all of the discussions about blood, I remember hearing growing up in rural Ohio. I lived in the middle of nowhere. I lived in a pretty conservative area, and it was pretty restrictive about what sort of was thought to be, okay, one way or another. And I remember hearing growing up, somebody just offhandedly said, I don't trust anything that bleeds for 7 days and doesn't die. And I was born in 1979. This is a modern thing that is said with all of the loaded weight of history of not trusting women, and fundamental distrust of the cycle, the menstruation cycle, as being something that is fundamentally makes that a lack of trust. I think that kind of fundamental suspicion is why the witchcraft label was lobbed at so many women. Again, men were victims of witch trials around the globe as well, but by percentage points, it was more aimed at women. And so I really just think that anything that seemed like it was a threat to a power dynamic that was trying to be set down, whether it was patriarchal forces, whether it was religious forces, women have been seen to be a threat along these lines, talking about men wanting to be doctors, that and move that out of the realm of the midwife. Any of those things that could be seen as perceived power dynamic shifts, that fundamental distrust is at the root of all of it. And I think, especially in a very Christianized culture, a lot of that comes down to looking at Eve as a character of human downfall. And so all of that for me is all right there in the pot as to what allowed the hysteria in 1692 to get as out of hand as it did. But what the great irony of that is that it was being driven by little girls who in puritanical New England had no power whatsoever. They were just property. And suddenly they were sort of given a microphone to name and shame their neighbors. And suddenly you're given a power that you don't have before. And much like how the Fox sisters in spiritualism got swept up into being the cornerstone of the spiritualist movement and psychic mediums and all that kind of stuff. And they were kids when they were sort of thrust into the limelight. And there's a whole lot of controversy about their whole life and about spiritualism in general, but women were at the core of a lot of spiritualist circles too. And I think that, the Fox sisters is a whole nother topic, but I think that the girls at the heart of the accusations in Salem, they were experiencing something that they were getting swept up, and suddenly their testimony was important. And so I think that the shift and the swing from being fundamentally distrusted and fundamentally suspect as a female, and then suddenly you're given a microphone. This was a shockingly powerful thing into this constant power struggle. So where incidents have happened on this historic timeline, where it's it's something we're still battling today, with a fundamental distrust of not believing women or their history or their bodies, or not taking their symptoms seriously, or any of the ways in which it factors into to everything we deal with globally as women.
Absolutely, ma'am. Thank you so much for putting out great points. Next question is for Madeline, ma'am. In relation to your monograph, Theological Monsters, Religion and Irish Gothic, how do theological monsters in Irish Gothic literature expose the religious conservatism imposed on women's identities? And how has this genre contributed to enduring association of women with themes of witchcraft and black magic, revealing the cultural transmission of fear and prejudice?
So I'm going to, so in my monograph, look, there are 3 chapters. One about Charles Robert Maturin, one about Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and one about Bram Stoker. They're all Irish Protestant writers. They all belong to the Church of Ireland. So what we get is a tendency for critical interpretations of their work to look at them as essentially enforcing an Irish Protestant worldview. So I'm going to take Dracula as an example, because I suppose that's the best known out of the 3, authors that I talk about. And we get Jonathan Harker going to Transylvania, and he's describing it as, this land of, he describes it as if it was taken out of an old missal. It's a primitive land in his, eyes. And of course, he comes face to face with an ancient evil, which is the vampire Dracula. So there's been a tendency to look at it as basically enforcing this sort of, traditional Irish Gothic, mainstream Protestantism point of view. But if you look at it a little bit more closely, I think there's a destabilization of that dominant Protestant discourse in the Irish Gothic genre. Because yes, we get the vampire, who's this ancient evil that's being resurrected, but he's not being fought with the forces of mainstream Protestantism. He's being fought, if we look at what works against the vampire, the crucifix works, which is a sacramental worldview going back to pre-Reformation religion, which often incorporated more kind of what, again, mainstream Protestantism might deem superstitious practices on the one hand, but on the other hand, we also get the garlic that works. We also get the wild rose that works. So there's a reclaiming of a magical world that essentially functions against the vampiric threat. And this world of magic is being, in 19th century fashion and late Victorian fashion, in a way being democratized, because we get these, bunch of English people, including Nina Harker, who I would say is the driving force of the novel, because she's the one who puts it all together. She's the one who goes to Van Helsing and says, "You need to hypnotize me, Professor." So there's a democratization, in a way, of these kind of ancient sources of wisdom and of theological knowledge that are being brought into fin de siècle England. So what I think the genre does is actually, through the use of the Gothic, and with an awareness of the perceived grotesquerie of this, it actually places monstrosity at the center of destabilization of mainstream Protestantism in view of actual kind of theological exploration. What can we take out of... I describe Dracula often as a kind of theological mosaic, in terms of it kind of plucks different ideas from different systems of belief and thought and brings them all together in this, fictional universe, obviously. But it does so to ask questions about, well, what can we learn from all these various practices? But again, with taking the step back, saying this is Gothic fiction. Bram Stoker is not himself embracing all these various practices. So there's that gap between biography and fiction. But it is used to ask various intellectual questions in that way. In terms of how it influences cultural perception, I will go back to my initial point that there's a big racialization element in it, because often, especially in Victorian Gothic literature, we do get the figure of the Romany woman, the Romany witch, at the center of this, sense of evil. Although that's, if you take Dracula again, the Roma are more collectively racialized and rendered, mysterious and threatening, rather than particular Romany women. But we do get in Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu a similar situation. So that continues in a line that also is very much applicable, I would say, to the English Gothic as well. Think about, Mr. Rochester cross-dressing as a Romany woman in Jane Eyre to indicate the destabilization of the plot. So I'm just kind of circling back to the point I made initially. So I hope that gives a little bit of an overview, Sarah, of what's going on there in the Gothic.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. It was actually an amazing answer. The next question is for Christine, ma'am. Ma'am, from the context of your book, An Anthropological Study of Spirits, how science helped to debunk the evil mystical discourses that were associated with the woman?
That is another great question, and one that's going to be hard to answer in a few minutes. But I think that if science is going to debunk this, which it should debunk this idea of women equals evil. I mean, that's really what we're saying, right? Women equals evil, which is not true. And I would say that we can look at the history of how we had the historic development, how they came to be this way, that when we understand the historical dynamics, if we can start understanding what each part is not correct, then we can start fighting that. And also understanding the other panelists have also talked about, men were also charged of witchcraft too. Yes, in lower percentage, maybe 20% in Europe, men were charged with witchcraft and also burned, but it's not a solo woman thing. It's not a woman's issue, right? And that's the important thing, is that altered states of consciousness, in a way that most people end up being able to understand mysticism, that can be done for male, female, child. It doesn't really have to do as much with being a woman, however you want to define that. It has to be with being human. And so, not to be cavalier, but it's hard not to be cavalier, right? But it's just a human problem. If anybody can be really good or anybody can be really evil, and that's a personal choice. And what's really unfortunate, though, and what I would like to see, is countering the idea that just because you don't understand somebody's culture or somebody's idea, don't stereotype and don't label it evil. I mean, that's I agree with Leanna. When I was reading into the witchcraft trials, and there are other ones in Europe that follow the same pattern, where all of a sudden a young girl, 9 years old in England, gets the show floor for the court of law, and all of a sudden you have these young girls doing that. It's just like, what is going on there, right? And so you have to wonder, why do people buy into that, and how do we even today, I still think we can make that mistake. I still think we haven't, I know it sounds terrible, but we haven't got that far from it and from these ideas. So how do we counter that? How do we debunk that? I think first is realizing that it's just a human issue, but there are a lot of good women, and there's a lot of, there were brilliant, I love the word brilliant, Dr. Potter, brilliant women that were able to do healings, able to use blood wisely, able to help with midwifery. They were really important, good skills. So how do we change the narrative to talk about the positive things that these supposedly labeled witches that were evil were do? I don't know about you guys, but the very first witch burned in Europe was a nun. She was a nun, and she was a conjuring in Italy. And I'm blanking on her name right now. I have her in my notes, but I'm like, I don't know, but that really bothers me. The idea that you could have a Christian practicing woman who's a midwife then being labeled to be a witch. And I don't know if I've ever read anything or anybody's written about that, but I think that needs to come to attention, that, you could take even in that time period, a practicing Roman Catholic nun and label her a witch and get her burned at the stake. I mean, so how do we debunk that? Well, I think showing the historic things, social, economic, jealousy, fear, suspicion that we've already talked about. I think pulling all that apart and looking at each piece is going to be how science can do that. And just because we don't understand something doesn't mean it's make-believe, false, or evil, that there may be underlying things working. And I would say with altered states of consciousness, there probably is something that we as humans can perceive that we don't fully understand. And this is a very famous quote. Magic is just science we don't understand. And so I still think that we're in the hopeful time where we still could use science to better understand the mysterious, the mysteries to get there. And that's not the best answer I have right now, but I think it's just gonna, if we're gonna debunk it, it's by pulling it apart, the knots, the puzzles, and piece by piece, saying this piece, this thread is not following, this does not make sense, this is not correct, this piece of the knot is not correct, and pulling it apart. But that's how I think we're going to debunk it in the world of science. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Thank you so much, ma'am. The next question I would like to ask Renee, ma'am. How have local communities been affected by the legends of female ghosts involved in witchcraft? And what role do these legends play in shaping community identity and memory?
The woman as spectral figure is very entwined. We talk in our book about women being associated with birth and death. Very often in a lot of different, there are many different cultures that make up the United States identities, but a lot of different folks historically were the ones responsible for laying out the dead, of washing the dead. And that was usually the purview of women before funeral parlors became popular in the 20th century. The term funeral parlor really didn't come into vogue until like the early 1900s. Before that, it was very much based in the home or a place of worship. And so it was very personal. So, you know, the concept of women bringing life into the world and seeing it out, that's a very liminal space into which a lot of the spectral as a identity, as a thought, as a form can come through. So the different ways in which women are stereotyped as ghosts, we break down our book into 7 different sections via a lot of stereotypes of, okay, we have the spinster witch, we have not the spinster witch necessarily. Sometimes there were spinsters who were also labeled witches, but in terms of the ghostly and witchcraft, those are a slightly 2 different tracks. So in terms of the spirits who are said to haunt, say, Salem, Massachusetts, that is all tied to the Salem witch trials as sort of this cultural horror. And there is ghost lore that's come out of that because of this horrible thing. Not that any of the people in 1692, none of those prosecuted as witches would consider themselves witches. All of them were Christians, and all of them were people of faith. And so just like Dr. VanPool was talking about, the concept of this nun was the one who was brought forward for witchcraft in this particular society. No one was out and publicly practicing as a witch in these cases. This was labeled onto them, but they considered themselves good, God-fearing Christians. And so in terms of the spectral, you have this huge realm of ghost lore that taps into all kinds of different stereotypes that go back to that fundamental distrust or that fundamental question of women alone. So spinsters and widows factor in a lot in ghost lore. The concept of, because historically women died in childbirth so often, or infant mortality rate was so high, that there is a concept of the grieving mother as a stereotype in ghost lore. So you have all of these ways in which there have been the intersections of where women fall into the suspect category, and how does that factor into the stories and narratives we tell about them as ghosts? Because very often there will be ghost stories that are really more of an amalgam of women's experience, and really more of kind of a collected tapestry that becomes a ghost rather than it being from a specific person. So it becomes sort of this urban legend, and maybe it started with a specific person, but we've lost their names to time. So so there's just this kind of cultural sense that there are more women ghosts out there than we could actually track and pinpoint them by name. We haven't done a full accounting. There's literally millions of ghost stories around the world, and every culture is going to come at this differently. So that's another thing that we have to be very clear about in our book, is that culturally all of these things are going to be different, depending on where you are regionally, depending on what again, the intersection of class and race and all of these things factor into stereotypes and factor into things like urban legends. So to wrap this up, basically any of the ways in which women have been marginalized historically, there's going to be a way in which that gets turned one way or another into a ghost story. Whether or not there is a legitimate history of paranormal activity in a given building or not, that's sort of almost secondary, because it's really the cultural sense of what does a haunting mean, and that's a real unanswered question. That really is still, people are so interested in the spectral and so interested in mysticism and magic and divination and any of these things that have very often been associated with women. So inevitably that gets woven into things like ghost stories, because it's part of this ongoing cultural narrative about something that ultimately we can't yet explain. But I do think that the paranormal, just like Dr. VanPool said, I think the paranormal is a part of science that we just don't understand yet.
Wonderful, ma'am. Thank you so much for your fascinating answer. The next question I would like to ask Madeline, ma'am. How have modern interpretations of 19th century Gothic literature addressed or reinterpreted the association of women with witchcraft and evil mysticism?
So I think actual interpretations of 19th century Gothic haven't done it very efficiently. But I'll begin by speaking a little bit more broadly about a tendency or a desire, I think, in modern media to try and reclaim the figure of the witch from these associations with evil. So think about, for example, Sabrina, the teen witch, or Willow in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They're made into a supposedly kind of feminist reclaiming of the figure of the witch because they're successful women, they're, good people, essentially. The catch is that if you look at it, most of these kind of reclaimings of the witch figure are going to be white women, usually quite affluent white women. So it's been a kind of white feminist reclaiming of the figure of the witch. When it comes to actual adaptations of 19th century literature, that figure of the Romany witch has not only remained there, but it's also continued to be made into a kind of tropified vision of the non-white woman as a dangerous threat to the stabilization of, this kind of order. When we get a kind of reclaiming, what we get is also whitewashing. So when there is an attempt to kind of place what has traditionally been a Romany witch in a kind of new narrative, there will be a white woman cast in this role. In fact, I'm not aware of one single Romany woman being cast in a Romany specific role in any adaptations of 19th century literature. So this reclaiming, the supposed reclaiming, kind of tends to feed into white feminist discourses. And to that, I will add also that Indigenous women are also represented in the same way, that there's this tendency to continue this association between Romany and Indigenous women with, you're more in tune with nature, you're more in tune with the cycles of everything. So I think in terms of pure adaptation of 19th century Gothic, unfortunately, there is so much work to be done. More broadly, as I said, I think there is a tendency to try and reclaim the figure of the witch, but it is at the moment again, being a 19th century specialist, so if people do know of adaptations that do manage to do it well, I would be more than happy to hear about them, because I haven't come across them. But I think there is a tendency to do it from the lens, from the point of view of white feminism, and I think we need to be pushing back against that a little bit more. I know that's not a great, that's not a very uplifting answer, but yeah.
But it's true.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like amazing. Like you have actually touched upon some very important points, and yeah. So now we are coming to the last but not the least question of our panel. How do modern perspective on gender equality and empowerment challenge traditional stereotypes linking women to witchcraft, black magic, and the concept of evil eye? Christian ma'am, you may begin to speak first.
So, could you repeat that one more time? I just want to make sure I'm following.
Sure, ma'am. How do modern perspectives on gender equality and empowerment challenge traditional stereotypes linking women to witchcraft, black magic, and the concept of evil eye?
Well, I thought that's what you asked. I really think that there's a lot of good stuff going on with some of the realization that gender is fluid and gender is a cultural label we put on something that we might call biological sex. And so the fact that now people are questioning what is it to be a man or what is it to be a woman, I think the good stuff that's coming out of that is that we don't have to have women equal evil mysticism, right? Instead, we can say that women can be all kinds of things. We can be a doctor, we can be a lawyer, we can be an electrician, we can be a firefighter, we can be, I don't know, I guess an underwater welder, and the same thing, men now I see a lot more nurses at the hospital that are male. I see what we call them administrative assistants. That's a great word, that are now secretaries. And it seems like our division between the sexes now, right? At least in America, I can only speak for America, are not as hard as they were even 10 years ago. And I'm really delighted that we're having that opening up, that you don't have to, just because you're born one biological sex, you're stuck there, right? You can do whatever you want, more or less. But I think that's also going to play out where we're not having the thought of, well, you're an old woman, I'm in my 50s, you're an old woman, you're going to turn into a witch. Well, maybe not, I don't know, but at least we can hope that there's ageism, there's racism, and there's sexism. With some of the new modern ideas, we're really kind of saying, gender roles are not binary. And with the loss of binary means we have a loss of the things attracted to or attached associated with that. So I think that's some of the better things that are happening in the modern context. They're fighting this idea against evil mysticism with women in the evil eye. But that's probably a little more hopeful. And so that's where I'm at. Thank you.
So true. And actually today the society has become more accepting, or at least through social medias we can say what we find wrong. So yeah, eventually the entire perspective of witchcraft as a whole is quite like eradicated. Ma'am, Leanna ma'am, over to you.
I think that it's a process, and there's a long way to go, because I do think that like the concept of modern witchcraft does sort of have a white feminism problem, for certainly. And so I think that continues to need to be examined, because things that are being reclaimed, that have been a historical stamp of evil, okay, how are we making sure that we're being intersectional about that empowerment? How can we make sure that that power is not just being grabbed and reclaimed by just one group of people? That's the question we need to keep asking. And I think in a lot of ways, because we are in a very global society that has access to a lot of different types of belief structures, I think there's something really beautiful and refreshing about the idea of people realizing that there are different global religions and there are different paths, and we just have a much more open global world in which we're talking about some of these great, big, historic and spiritual questions. There's a real opening up of the unknown, and also the human need to believe in something, the human need for faith or practice or ritual of some kind. And I think there's a lot of hope in that. But again, the human need to create power structures and enforce them, and try to have sort of a battle over who gets to tell the story, or who gets to be the arbiters of being a practitioner of any number of beliefs. All of those things are going to replicate, if we don't examine it, some of these problems that we've been discussing as historical trajectories here. So I think in the ways in which the realm of ghost lore reclaims a certain amount of things for women's history, for me and Andrea, we like the idea of the spectral, the ghostly woman, whether she was wronged in life or she was just unknown in life. That concept of a ghost sort of outliving her time period is kind of a powerful figure, in that she sort of gets to persist even beyond the realm and constraints of her historical situation. So some of why we're still talking about some of the victims of the Salem witch trials and saying their names, and now there are memorials there that didn't used to be there back when Salem wasn't, as a town, talking about it as openly as it does now. We're getting a chance to kind of see, okay, well, who were these actual people? And in that, because of this staying power of the ghost story, sometimes it's a way to circle back to, okay, but who were they in life? And that's the thing that, for me, I'm interested in, the ghost as reclaiming a certain amount of history, because we're still interested. Something's happening in this haunted house. Okay, well, what is it really? And sometimes you can find some really, really rich history in that, beyond just what is a titillating ghost story or something that's meant to evoke, fear and excitement and entertainment. Sure, that's the lure of a ghost tour. But at the heart, okay, well, what history can we reveal? And what ways in which this person's story persists? What about it can we use to inform our lives now? How can we use what happened to these people as a prompt to making sure that we're not repeating some of those same mistakes historically into our modern world?
Absolutely, ma'am. Thank you so much for your insightful views. Madeline, ma'am, over to you now.
Yeah, and just as a little bit of a note, that my answer is going to contain some references to sexual violence. So I did speak earlier about how in the 19th century blood was having this sort of semi-magical characteristic, and then because it was associated with the female body postpartum hemorrhage, then the whole female body became somewhat mysterious and contributed to these associations. I think that's still very much the case today, unfortunately. So I'm going to reference the comment made by a US politician a few years ago that if it is a legitimate rape, the female body has a way of shutting down the pregnancy. And also for example, there's just been a study on tampons and what they contain, and it's just been revealed that they contain arsenic. And it is the first study of its kind ever to be conducted. So up until then, things that were related to menstruation, to the female body, were just, again, not studied, were kind of pushed back into that realm of the unknown. I've also seen various, and this is empirical observations, because this is not, I work on the 19th century again. But for example, people thinking that women can hold in the periods, or various other kind of ideas, or don't dye your hair when you're on your period. A lot of unscientific information about the female body that is actually completely nonsensical. And that actually just continues to feed into that image of women as magic or mysterious, as if women's bodies work in ways that are somehow outside the laws of nature, that there's something impossible to understand, impossible to pin down, impossible to describe scientifically about the way that women's bodies work. And I think that's very much kind of the same type of narrative that then contributes to this association between women and mystery, women and magic, women, as you know, Leanna, you said, don't trust anything that bleeds for 7 days and doesn't die, which is again that sort of mysticization of menstruation, of the period. And I think these discourses continue to be somewhat dominant despite great progress made, especially in the Western world. But I think there's still a lot of pushback to be done and a lot of education that needs to happen for us to extricate these, connotations that exist. Sorry again, I seem to be the one who always sort of comes up with a more pessimistic perspective, or
No, I
perhaps
think
just
it's
more
absolutely very
realistic.
interesting.
But
And and I think it was needed to touch upon this particular point of yes, menstruation cycle was in various cultures also was seen as impure, and even today it is somewhere or the other in very rural areas it's still seen in that eye. So yeah, just because of women have like these powers of say birth or menstrual cycle doesn't mean that we are in any way different. So yeah,
yeah.
thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Christine VanPool, Leanna Renee Hieber, and Dr. Madeline Potter for your very insightful conversation and for your valuable time this evening. Tell Me Your Story calls for submission on the writing prompt, Echoes and Whispers, which intends to explore various noises and conversations emerging from our internal and external hemispheres. Registration are also open for a host of workshops for new or aspiring authors. We hope to hear from you soon. Till then, stay well, stay happy, stay together. Good. Have a nice day and good night.